We have two more panels, Disinformation and Democracy. I'm sure you can see where this is going. We have three tech companies coming on stage here to discuss the different technologies available for governments and organizations to utilize to fight this global issue. We have Ben Colman, CEO of Reality Defender, Tom Garnett, CEO of a stealth startup, and Jonathan Luff of Recorded Future. Leading this discussion is Caroline Daniels of the Brunswick Group. Give them a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're nearly there. I'm going to start by reading out a quote from Senator Richard Blumenthal at the AI elections and deepfakes judicial hearing in America earlier this year. And he basically warned of a deluge of deception, disinformation, and deepfakes is about to descend on America and the American public, and this represents a danger to our democracy. So apart from the level of alliteration and the number of Ds in that quote from the Senator, do you agree with that? And I'm going to start with Jonathan. Do you agree that there's a real danger to democracy, and particularly to elections, from what's happening with deepfakes?
Thank you, Caroline. I think I'll start by drawing attention to two things there. That's the start of the year, and a lot has happened since the Senator made those comments. My slightly unfashionable opinion is that, particularly at the start of the year, there was a huge amount of hype and hysteria around disinformation and the likely disruption to this year of elections. We've had, I think, more than half the world has been to the polls or is going to the polls this year. And I think that bred a kind of, as I said, a bit of hysteria about the impact of AI, impact of deepfakes, impact of disinformation, and I think it was overblown. Now, that is not to diminish the challenge, and we'll come to that perhaps, but I think there was a sort of loss of perspective in some of these conversations at the start of the year. And I think you've seen in elections since then, particularly the election here, that we're still able to hold free, fair elections. And while there have been some very interesting examples of attempts at disinformation, attempts to disrupt, they haven't been successful. And I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on that. I'd make one comment, which is that all of that anxiety and all of that sort of discussion led to some very positive things. I think we've had some fantastic speakers here today at the conference from across the national security community, and it's worth, I think, paying tribute to people like Felicity Oswald and the team at NCSC, and all of those working on the Defending Democracy Task Force, which I was briefly involved in at the start of the year. Mm-hmm. A genuine whole-of-society effort to plan and prepare, to red team, to sort of try and understand what might go wrong, which then, I think, was part of the reason for why we had such a smooth election here in the summer.
So just to pick up on that, there was a story last week from the Alan Turing Institute when they also sort of made a similar point that actually the level of apocalypse hasn't actually come out in the European elections, the European Parliament elections, and the UK elections this year. I want to hand over to Ben. I think you're probably more at the kind of it is a danger to democracy end of the spectrum. Just be great to get your take on how worried should we be and how worried are you, particularly right now when you're sitting in America, you just phoned in from California, about the state of play, particularly in the US.
Thank you. I may first say I'm very, very optimistic about the future, but currently we're in a impossible situation where technology is moving much faster than any regulations to protect it, and we're seeing deepfake attacks, used to defraud or defame or disinform. They're being used not only to create fake media, but also to create the accounts that then disseminate these disinformation narratives. So it's this kind of a infinity times infinity of explosion of media, and if people don't see it, they just don't know where to look.
So where are you looking then? Given that your role, and you were thinking about this in 2021 when you founded the company.
Sure.
How has it changed now from that moment in time, obviously beyond generative AI? What are you seeing now which has made it much worse as a story?
So I think our challenge is that AI has permeated every level of society. We use it every day. We use it to write emails, automate recipes, but every part of disinformation and disinformation narrative propagation can now be automated, and it can be customized to every single person in this audience. In the US, we had that deepfake audio of President Biden telling people not to vote in the primaries. It was a kind of a one-to-one asynchronous attack. But what we're now seeing is customized deepfakes targeting each one of us, targeting not just senior people, but also junior election workers saying, don't go to work today, or we need you somewhere else across town. That is what we're seeing, and that's what we expect to increase in volume in a year when 68% of the world has an election.
So again, just to sort of pick up on America, beyond the sort of issue with Joe Biden and the robocalls at the beginning of the year, what else specifically have you seen in the work you've been doing?
We're seeing live, real-time, face-to-face deepfakes in Zoom and Microsoft Teams on Meet, where it sounds like, it looks like, the voice matches perfectly as well. And that's specifically what us as a company proved to solve in terms of our AI to detect AI. The challenge, though, is that a lot of organizations, whether it's government or large companies, they're not set up to even respond to it yet.
I'm just going to sort of bring in Tom as well on the sort of how far. You obviously got a wide background both in counterterrorism and RIP, John. You're now in stealth mode with your new company. Given that sort of broad perspective from being both in startup and in government, how worried are you about sort of both in the deepfakes, both affecting elections, and what's your focus right now?
Yeah, so I think at the moment, I mean, as you've heard from this panel, a lot of the focus has been around the elections. That is the big topic at the moment, and really has been since 2016. But I think the real change that's happened over the last couple of years has actually been affecting the commercial sector. So what we've seen with generative AI, we've seen it with the geopolitical situation around the world, is there's almost being an asymmetric response to what's happening. So for example, in the high-risk industries that we call them, so just outside CNI, whether that's oil and gas, mining, renewables, financial services, pharmaceuticals, it's really becoming a board-level risk in those areas. So we were researching and we're seeing some live monitoring literally over the last few weeks, particularly around Rio Tinto, for example. The work they're doing with lithium mining, they're about to do in Serbia, has suddenly hit a massive disinformation campaign, which is really coming from an environmental impact that has massive consequences. And people might think, well, this is just affecting a particular organization. It's just with regards to their profits and their valuations. But it's not. It has such a larger impact. So whether it's affecting climate change, tackling crime, economic growth, it affects democracy in the end. And it is, from my perspective, it's part of resilience, but it's not necessarily defense or national security, but it's intertwined with that.
And how well do you think businesses are set up for that at the moment? I have my own perspective from where I sit, but obviously you created a startup to solve this. You obviously think there's a great opportunity there.
Yeah. So as I say, I think things have changed rapidly over the last few years. I mean, if you look at, so from a regulation perspective, if you look at the EU Digital Services Act or the Online Safety Bill that's coming on board in the UK, it's very much focused on the end citizens, the governments, elections, democratic process, but it's much less focused, if anything at all, on the end commercial organizations. So what that means is the social media platforms, they're not having to protect those end commercial organizations. So you end up seeing those commercial organizations are having to protect themselves. And they're really coming from a very greenfield site with very little protection. So certainly from our perspective, it's like cybersecurity is 10 years ago. And that's just talking about detecting these threats, let alone how on earth do they respond and how they scale as well.
Ben, I want to come back to something. So last week, the US agencies issued a report, and they were sort of concerned about deepfake influence in the American election, and particularly from Russia, China, and Iran, not surprisingly. And obviously saying that AI is helping to improve the accuracy and improve the acceleration of disinformation.
Right.
Just wondering your take on that, and also what are you seeing in terms of the differences between how Russia is using disinformation in the States and other markets, and what you're seeing from China or other actors? What are some of the differences? And any examples to bring it to life would be great.
AI fraud in general is equal opportunity. It's available to everybody, and bad actors are using it in all situations. I'd say what's been most interesting is deepfakes and generative AI not used to create new fake media, but to find certain issues and help them propagate using AI-generated accounts. So social media profiles with ad-generated faces and ad-generated voices. And what they're trying to do, particularly in the United States, is pick hot-button issues that divide U.S., since right now we're effectively in a very much 50-50 election and 50-50 on most of the major issues. And so we're seeing different groups generating massive amount of synthetic humans online to programmatically evangelize certain positions. And as was just mentioned, these platforms, the social media platforms, because there's no regulations in the US, at least not at a national level, they're doing nothing. They're doing actually less than nothing. They're asking you and I and our grandparents and our children to flag misinformation, to flag deepfakes. Imagine a world where your email, Google or Microsoft, asks you to flag ransomware. It's the same analogy. PhDs in my team, we have over 30. They can't tell the difference with their own eyes. That means my grandparents, my parents, just don't stand a chance.
So just to pick up on this, Jonathan, when we spoke yesterday, you were also in a similar space that actually a lot of the risk is in the sort of acceleration of discontent and dissension and disunity in different countries. I'm picking up my Ds from the senator, clearly. And you mentioned there around the sort of rise of LLM-generated fake news websites, but also around social media bots where the LLMs are actually creating the backstories for the bots to make them look more credible.
Yeah.
And I think you called them like sleeper cells in a similar way from the past. So I wonder if you could just sort of unpack what you've been seeing around that and how far that's a bigger level of concern because it's affecting everyday life, not just elections.
I think this is a fascinating area to discuss because it goes to the changing nature of our information environment. To your specific question about what we've seen, we've reported on the use of as Ben and Tom were discussing there, the use of LLMs to generate much higher quality content and to produce it at scale is very much a phenomenon that we see. I was talking to Becky Waite at OpenAI last week. She runs their global response program, and I thought she made quite an interesting point by saying that you shouldn't confuse an information operation with an influential operation. And the problem, as Ben was alluding to it there, a lot of this content is being distributed by bots, and it's not necessarily reaching a level of public consciousness where it's having an effect yet. And perhaps that is why we haven't seen a huge amount of actual disruption to the processes that we care about. But as I was saying at the start, it's not a reason not to care. We absolutely should care, and companies like Ben's and Tom's and ours are very, very active in this space. But there is an intense competition for the information environment. But I don't think it's all taking place in fake content, in sort of malicious traffic. We saw after the elections here some rather old-fashioned use of misinformation to encourage violence and hatred. Yeah. And I asked the team whether they could track in any of that data evidence of malicious foreign interference, and they could not. It was just old-fashioned misinformation, falsehoods being spread by people on their social networks. So I think we have to be careful. But do you think then it's just the media putting everything into the same bucket? I think there's a danger, yeah. We're sort of oversimplifying, and we're sort of getting a little, we're rushing to sort of call something something it's not. Tom made a very interesting point there about misinformation, disinformation being the new cyber. I think that there is definitely something in that. The one thing I would say is that whereas cyber, over the last 10 years, huge amounts of time and effort and money have gone into that from a relatively low base. Brands, to Tom's point about business, brands care a huge amount about their reputation. And anything that touches it is going to draw in capital, is going to draw in technology, is going to draw in innovators like Tom and like Ben.
Actually, there was an interesting story to your point about influence, and the fact that they can do it at scale doesn't mean it's always accurate either. I don't mean just disinformation, but there was a story about a Russian generative campaign, and then they were using generative AI prompts, but unfortunately they didn't realize that they were publishing prompts as well when they published the disinformation, so that didn't really help so much. But Ben, I can see you're itching to get in.
Yeah, I think it's really fundamental that this type of fraud is not happening on a monumental level, at least not yet. But I want to remind everybody that it doesn't have to be monumental to have a massive effect on democracy, particularly in the US. We have an election right now where we have a few different states that may be won or lost by less than 10,000 votes. Now, 10,000 votes, it's not that many people, both in terms of voters, both in terms of the election workers. If we get a few places that happen to close early, or there's the appearance they're closing early and people don't show up to vote, these small states could completely skew the election.
So just before you jump into it, that is really fascinating. The US situation is clearly different to the UK situation. Just the structure of the system is different. But I was talking to somebody working in one of the southern states last week in the US who pointed out that something just as simple as a DDoS attack on the website of the voter registration page in that state on the day of the election itself can have every bit as much of an impact as a much more sophisticated sort of planned and executed disinformation campaign, because it could have a 5,000 votes here, 2,000 votes there effect. So there are huge challenges to our elections.
All right,
but
so
I think
we're feeling gloomier again. Tommy, you're going to make us feel a little bit more cheerful.
Well, sorry, I was just going to build on one of the questions you asked earlier. So from my perspective, from a generative AI side, what it's doing is it's not necessarily changing how influence operations are taking place. It's making it easier, making it cheaper, accelerating it, and meaning it's quicker actually to evolve and be more agile in terms of what they're doing. So I think one of the interesting things you were talking about earlier is the ability to create fake news sites and to create those rapidly with a voice and a language which is positioned exactly of the audience to make it look exactly like a UK, a US, a European news site. But then once it gets taken down, to establish itself in a different means rapidly for that audience. And it's becoming, as generative AI develops, it's becoming more and more confusing to understand that unstructured text and structured content for the end users, particularly if people aren't aware of this type of content that they might be seeing.
But just to double down on this, it's, again, I think we're thinking so broadly because we're used to seeing such massive amounts of information and effects on that information. But to give you a very micro example of this, thinking about a university, for example, in Arizona, and a building, one dormitory where students are living, I read a stat this morning that if one of these buildings has what looks like a fire drill, or their parking lot electrical system doesn't actually let cars out because people think that there's an issue, that will be enough to skew the election. And so you don't need a lot of an effect. You don't need a national news breach. It can be very, very hyper-local to specific voters or specific people who are working on those days during the election.
To pick up on something that you said in the Senate earlier this year about how far, you were very worried at that point, now this is back in April, about the fact that we need legislation, particularly federal legislation, to make a difference to stop deepfakes having a sizable impact on the election. Obviously, fast forward to now, there has been no federal intervention. There has been some sense at the state level in terms of intervention. So what should the government be doing now? If you start to say who's responsible for doing something about this, what do you want to see happen in the US government?
The analogy I think I gave within my testimony in the US Senate Judiciary Committee was a lot of these patchwork legislation, it'd be like putting a sign in front of a bank saying, guns are not allowed in this bank. And maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. But what really works is putting a metal detector there and saying we're checking for guns. Right now, this patchwork of legislation is very much saying things are bad, as opposed to requiring them not to happen by actively checking for them.
So without federal action, who else should take responsibility?
So any consumer-facing platform, social media, streaming, professional networking, anything that is where average consumers and corporates are ingesting information. They already have rules saying they can't provide violence or nudity or underage imagery. They can't do copyright violations. Checking for generative media is just another check that we can do completely programmatically in the same flow. When you upload a video onto YouTube, it's checking for all these things. It's checking to see if you upload a Taylor Swift song, checking to see if there's nudity. Why not also check to see if there's generative media, which might be okay, but is enough of a signal that would change the actual risk of a piece of media to be shown to mass markets.
But given it's so close in the US election, why hasn't it happened? Given that everyone knows it really matters this year more than any other year, that we should be, and this is the most talked about issue in tech and is generative AI, why has it not happened?
That might be above my pay grade, but what I'm learning working in Washington, D.C. and here in London and in the EU is that I think that speaks to all legislation targeted technology. It's just not as quick as the technology it's trying to protect us against.
Jonathan, what's your view about why it hasn't happened, and what should governments be doing? or other parts of government?
I think probably unrealistic if we think government has the answer to this, at least in the short term. I think what you will see is, it's overused, but we will innovate our way through some of this. You're already seeing examples of that here. This is an opportunity, actually, to identify issues that matter to people. If you produce products and services that matter to people, you've got the makings of a very successful business there. And I think there are going to be all sorts of innovative solutions to help us understand. I also think we just adapt. I think this is a challenge for us all. These are, as Ben was saying, these are exponential technologies. They are capable of things that we didn't imagine possible 2 or 3 years ago, and we are all finding it somewhat challenging to adapt to that. But I'm not sure adaptation is beyond us.
But it's interesting that you said you'd also been to see in Sweden they've created a new psychological defence agency, which is a kind of an interesting example of the kind of it falls between lots of different agencies. These issues.
Yeah, that sits there within their national security system. But I think they are experimenting with approaches to this. I think it's a very fair question to ask. Is that the right place for an agency charged with protecting the nation from psychological attack? But they're nonetheless, they're trying something new, and I think audiences like this, companies like Ben's and Tom's and ours, others in the room are all part of an experiment to respond to this incredibly fast-paced environment.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think there's clearly a technology element, hence of all of us being here today, but I think there's, and it's a word that's often overused, is collaboration. There are multiple different invested organizations as part of the wider community. So we talk about national security, there's wider parts of the government as well. You've got the social media platforms, you've got the generative AI companies, you've got technology providers that are involved in the detection, the response, but also you've got the end corporates as well. And I think it's all about how do these organizations work together, both from setting the standards in terms of how information is shared, but also in collaborating on the response as well. And I think that is key, not just about the elections, but much wider from a resilience perspective.
I have 2 fingers up, but Jonathan got there first, Ben. So
yeah, I think we might be a little bit too optimistic about industry solving it for themselves. Pick your favorite social media platform. None of us are the actual customer. We're the product being sold. We're being sold to eyeballs. And their business is based on clicking on advertisement. I would argue they actually might prefer more chaos, more deepfakes, because it creates more money for their advertising. And we've tried for years to get them to think about this. And right now what we're seeing, particularly in the United States, is industry saying, trust us to solve this. We have a walled garden. Stay here. Don't leave. It might be good for Google and Adobe, but it's certainly not good for innovation, because bad actors aren't going to follow those rules. They'll be on the other side of the fence using open source tools that aren't relegated to the regulations.
So let's fast forward from where we are now in the next few years. If you had to look ahead, given where we know generative AI and the technologies are going, what's your biggest fear about, we haven't had a legislation in a critical election year. What's your biggest fear based on the kind of tech you're seeing and the kind of evidence you're seeing, Ben?
The biggest fear?
Yeah.
I would actually turn it around. I'm actually very optimistic that it will be solved in real time, but it will require regulations to require platforms to treat it like any other threat, with continuous monitoring and requiring the platforms themselves to do it for consumers.
And you said something which is off the record in the room. I wonder if you want to mention the kind of technologies, capabilities that you're now developing as well to solve some of these issues. I wonder if you want to.
Yeah, our focus is on audio, video, images, and text, deepfakes tied to all those. The challenge is you need a lot of cloud compute to do that, and confidentially we're going to be launching with NVIDIA, deploying on bare metal, actual laptops and without any cloud computation, which will open a whole new world of applications to run them locally. And more importantly, also confidential, will be launching real-time video as well. So a world where trusting who's on the other side of Zoom is no longer possible in the world of remote work. So really excited for new use cases there, particularly across national security.
Seems we're in an optimistic last minute. So, Jonathan, you've been optimistic.
This is why I'm confident. This is why, I go back to the beginning. I have a slightly unfashionable view on this, that we'll be fine. Like, we'll work this out. These are some extraordinary challenges, but we're more than capable of coping with them. We have, we see at first-hand efforts by Russia, China, others to distribute content that's intended to be harmful, but we're capable of staying on top of that and ahead of that. And I think that's super excited for. I should declare an interest that our company has a small investment in Ben's company. Right?
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure. So I'm really excited about what we can do. And as I say, I think we're demonstrating election by election. We'll see in America that we are still capable of holding free and fair elections. All
right. Are you going to be gloomy or optimistic at the end of this, Tom?
Yeah, so I'm optimistic, but I also think back to my earlier point, there's a challenge with the toolkit that, say, a Russian state actor has or a Chinese state actor, is because of generative AI, is that becomes cheaper and easier for then commercial actors to also use as well. So I think we're starting to solve what's happening from a democratic perspective and a government perspective, but that then mirrors out to a much wider audience as well, which scales.
And we saw the run, the Twitter run on Silicon Valley Bank. Was led by a social media post which could have been a bit of misinformation, which could have led to run on the bank. I mean, sorry, I just made it gloomy at the end. We're all optimistic, and I ruined it. But I think we're now out of time too, so I'm going to thank Ben, Tom, and Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.